The widow sat rigid in the dimly lit parlor, her black-gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Her mourning veil hung heavy over her face, obscuring all but the pale curve of her jaw and the faint glimmer of her eyes beneath the sheer fabric. Across from her, the photographer adjusted his cumbersome camera, his gloved fingers moving with the careful precision of a surgeon. The polished brass knobs gleamed in the low gaslight, the mechanical components clicking softly as he prepared the exposure plate. He did not rush. This was a delicate process, one that required patience, one that, if done correctly, could pull back the veil between the living and the dead. "I assure you, Mrs. Ashbury," he said in a measured, solemn tone, "my process is genuine. The spirits, they linger." The widow, Charlotte Ashbury, offered only the slightest nod. She did not believe in such things, or rather, she had not wanted to believe. Charlotte had been a wife of comfort, though not of excessive wealth. Her husband had been a respected but unremarkable businessman, managing a profitable but modest shipping enterprise that ferried goods along the murky waters of the Thames. They had lived in a stately home on the outskirts of London, a house built in another era, with ornate wooden staircases, dust-heavy chandeliers, and rooms that whispered with memories. Though they had no children, their marriage had been kind, not passionate, not a great love, but comfortable. Then came the accident. 4 months ago, from the river, his lungs filled with water, his face twisted in a final grimace. They said he had fallen from the dock, a misstep in the fog, a tragic accident. And yet, Charlotte had never truly believed it. Henry had never been careless, and worse, the house was not empty. At first, she had dismissed the feeling. But then, the breath in an empty room, the rustling of pages in Henry's study, though no one had touched them. The candle that flickered though there was no breeze, a shadow that moved, just beyond her vision. She had tried to tell herself it was grief playing tricks on her. Then, the whispers began, soft at first, indistinct, like the sound of a voice beneath the water. And so, she had called for Jonathan Harrow, the famous photographer of the dead. Mr. Jonathan Harrow was no ordinary man. His name had become a whispered legend among those who still clung to the hope of speaking with the departed. A photographer of the occult, a man whose images had captured things that should not be seen. His portraits were known across London, photographs of widows sitting solemnly, only for the developed image to reveal ghostly figures standing behind them. A husband's pale hand on a shoulder, a mother's face peering from behind a curtain, though she had been buried a year before. Some called him a fraud, others called him a gifted medium. Charlotte did not care what he was. She only cared if he could prove what she already feared. The flash ignited with a violent burst of silver light, flooding the dim parlor with an eerie brilliance. The air itself seemed to hum with the energy of the exposure, vibrating with something unseen. Charlotte flinched but did not move, her posture rigid, locked in place like a figure sculpted from grief. The shutter clicked. And just like that, it was done. Jonathan Harrow exhaled softly, lowering the camera with the reverence of a priest concluding a ritual. He adjusted the glass plate with gloved fingers, his touch deliberate, reverent. "It is finished, Mrs. Ashbury," he murmured. "You will have your photograph by morning." Charlotte barely nodded. She had expected nothing. No sign of Edward. No ghostly imprint lingering in the chemical process. No confirmation of the presence she swore she felt in this house, breathing in the darkness, shifting in the silence. And yet, even as Harrow packed his equipment, even as he stepped into the gray London mist and disappeared down the gaslit street, the parlor felt no emptier. The air did not settle. The weight of something remained, something that had been drawn closer by the flash of the camera. The photograph arrived the following afternoon. It sat on her desk, wrapped in plain brown paper, sealed with a delicate string, like something waiting to be opened. Charlotte hesitated. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, peeling away the layers slowly, deliberately, as if she already knew what she would find beneath. The paper rustled against the silence. The portrait revealed itself. Charlotte stared, and the breath left her body. The photograph was crisp, precise. Jonathan Harrow was known for his meticulous work. His exposures were said to capture more than faces. They captured the essence of their subjects. And Charlotte had expected to see herself, a grieving widow draped in mourning black, seated stiffly in the parlor, framed by the heavy curtains that swallowed the light. But she was not alone. Behind her, half hidden in the shadows, just beyond the glow of the gas lamp, stood a figure. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a flaw in the exposure, a trick of the light. But no. The longer she stared, the clearer he became. Edward, her husband, or what was left of him. Edward stood unnaturally still, frozen in a posture that did not belong to the living. His hands hung limp at his sides, fingers curled inward like withered branches. But it was his face that sent a spear of ice-cold terror through Charlotte's chest. It was wrong. Not faint and ghostly, not blurred like a trick of the exposure. Edward's face was too present, and twisted in agony. His lips were pulled back in a soundless scream, revealing teeth gritted in torment. His hollow eyes, wide, too wide, glistened with something black, something wet. His skin was gray, stretched too tightly over his skull, sagging in places as if waterlogged, as if he had been pulled from the depths of a lake. And his hands, God, his hands. The fingers were blackened, burned, curled into themselves like something had held them in fire, like something had tried to keep him there. This was not Edward as he had lived. This was Edward as he had died, as he had rotted. And yet, he was standing behind her, watching as if he had been there all along. The photograph slipped from Charlotte's grasp. It hit the desk with a soft, hollow thud. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, her vision tunneling as her mind fought against the impossible reality. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A mistake, a trick of the exposure. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing a hand against her chest as if she could hold her pounding heart in place. And then, a voice. Soft, broken, so close, too close, as if whispered directly into her ear. Charlotte. Her breath hitched. A rush of cold air brushed the nape of her neck. The sensation of breath. Not warm, not human. Damp, rotting, cold. Her eyes snapped open. She did not turn around. She would not turn around. But she felt it. A presence. Standing right behind her. The very place it stood in the photograph. Watching, waiting. Charlotte did not sleep that night. How could she? The image of the photograph was still burned into her mind. The unnatural way Edward's face had been frozen in agony. His mouth twisted in a silent scream, his hollow, black eyes staring at her through the veil of death. She had tried to convince herself it was an illusion, a fault in the exposure, a mistake, but deep in her bones, she knew better. The house was not empty. Something was here, and it wanted her to know it. The night pressed heavy against the house. The air had changed since the arrival of the photograph, thickening like a storm about to break. Yet when Charlotte pressed her palm against the glass of her bedroom window, she felt nothing. No wind, no rain, no storm, just the vast, suffocating silence. Yet outside, something moved. Shadows shifted in the gaslit street, stretching too long, spilling across the cobblestones in shapes that did not match the figures that cast them. Charlotte swallowed hard and pulled the curtains shut. And then, from somewhere inside the house, a creak. A soft, deliberate step. Not outside, not the wind, inside. Her breath hitched. She strained to listen, willing the sound to be her imagination. Another step, then another. The wood groaned beneath the weight of something unseen. It was coming closer. Her fingers dug into the sheets, her body rigid beneath the heavy blankets. She tried to calm her breath, to slow the rapid beating of her heart, but she could feel it now. The presence, moving, closer. Her bedroom door was shut, but she heard it, on the other side. The creaking stopped. For a moment, the silence stretched too long. Then, the door handle twitched, a quiet, deliberate rattle, as if someone, something, was testing the lock. Her stomach twisted. She wanted to cry out, to run, to do anything but stay frozen beneath the covers. But she did not move. She could not. A breath, not hers. A whisper, right beside her ear. "Charlotte." Charlotte gasped, her entire body locking up. The voice was familiar and impossibly close, not from the door, not from the hallway, right beside her. She felt it now, the weight of something standing at her bedside. The heat of a presence that was not human. Something looming, watching, waiting. She forced herself to turn. Nothing was there. But something had been. She could feel it. The air still buzzed with its absence. And then, her eyes fell on the nightstand. The same one she had buried beneath a pile of papers in her study. It was here, staring up at her. Edward's face warped in agony. But something had changed. His eyes. They had been fixed forward in the original image. Now, they were looking at her. Charlotte's breath hitched, her fingers trembling as she reached for the photograph. The edges were ice cold against her skin, the paper curling slightly, as if touched by something unseen. The longer she stared, the more she felt it. The air in the room was thick with something unspeakable. And then, a sound, a breath, a voice, soft, so close. "Why did you leave me?" The candle flickered violently and went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and Charlotte was not alone. The night did not end. Charlotte did not sleep. She could not. Not after the whisper in the dark, not after seeing the photograph change before her eyes. She remained frozen in bed, her breath shallow, her body trembling beneath the heavy blankets. The candle was out. The moon offered no comfort through the curtains, leaving the room in a suffocating blackness. She should have risen, should have lit another candle, should have run from the room, from the house, from whatever lingered in the shadows. But she couldn't. Something was there. She could feel it. Not in the way one feels a draft, or senses a presence in the distance. This was closer. It hovered just beyond the reach of her sight, pressing against the AR itself. And then, a touch, cold, wet, against the back of her neck. Charlotte choked on a gasp, her fingers clutching the sheets so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. The sensation lingered, a slow, damp pressure, like fingers dragging lightly across her skin. She wanted to turn, to face it, to know if she was imagining it, if the thing in the dark was truly there. But then, another touch, this time along her arm, a slow, deliberate pressure, like something brushing against her sleeve, curling around her wrist. The whisper returned, soft, damp, right beside her ear. "You left me." Charlotte did what she had not done all night. She screamed. She did not remember when the whispering stopped, or when the weight lifted from the air. Somewhere in the suffocating darkness, exhaustion overtook her. But it was not rest. It was more like her body had surrendered. The first rays of dawn crawled through the curtains, casting pale golden light across the room. Charlotte blinked. The night was over. But the fear had not left her. Her fingers were still cold, her muscles sore from the tension that had gripped her all night. She sat up slowly, her breath unsteady, her eyes darting to the photograph. It sat on her nightstand, right where it had been when the candle went out. Charlotte hesitated before reaching for it, her pulse hammering in her throat. She swallowed hard, lifting the photograph into the light. And then, her stomach dropped. The picture had changed again. Edward's face was not as it had been. Before, he had looked twisted in agony, mouth open in a silent scream. Now, his mouth was open wider, the lips pulled back too far. His eyes were different too, no longer just filled with pain. They were staring at her, directly at her, following her. The ink on the photograph was shifting, like something rotting from the inside. The edges of the paper were curling, darkening, like flesh decaying in slow motion. A tremor ran through her hands. This was wrong. This was impossible. This was not Edward. She shoved the photograph down onto the nightstand, her breathing shallow. It had to go. She didn't know if it was madness, if it was grief twisting her mind, forcing her to see things that weren't there. But she knew one thing. She could not keep it. Charlotte threw back the covers and climbed out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. The room felt heavier, as if the very air resisted her movement. She wouldn't let it stop her. She would not spend another night with this thing in her house. It had to burn. Charlotte snatched the photograph from the nightstand, barely glancing at it as she clutched it to her chest. She would take it to the fireplace. She would set it alight and watch it burn into nothing. She turned toward the door. And then, the latch clicked. The door slowly creaked open by itself. Charlotte stopped dead in her tracks. A slow, sickening dread curled around her spine. She had locked it. The lock had been turned. She was certain of it. She took a step back, her knuckles turning white around the photograph. The door swung wider, groaning on its hinges. A sliver of the hallway stretched beyond it, the morning light barely piercing through the heavy shadows. And then, from deep within the house, a sound, a slow, wet footstep, not from outside, from inside. Something was already here. Charlotte's hands were trembling. She could barely keep hold of the photograph as she shut the door, locking it once more, though she now understood that locks meant nothing. The whispers, the touch in the night, the shifting image of her dead husband. Edward was not at rest. The thought made her stomach twist. If he was not gone, if he was truly here, trapped in some inescapable state between this world and the next, then why? Why had he not moved on? And more importantly, why had he not reached her sooner? A fresh wave of nausea rolled over her. She could not ignore it any longer. There had to be something, some record, some proof of what had been happening before his death, a reason why he would be bound to this place. Charlotte needed answers, and she knew where to find them. The study. Edward's study had remained untouched since the day he died. A grand room lined with towering bookshelves, filled with the scent of old parchment and dust. His polished desk sat beneath the window, still arranged as if he would return at any moment. She hesitated at the threshold. It felt wrong to enter, as if she were stepping into someone else's home. But she forced herself forward. Her fingers traced over the spines of his books, old tomes on law and philosophy, the occasional collection of poetry that she had once teased him for enjoying. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Yet the unease in her chest only grew stronger. Her gaze swept across the room, looking for anything that might give her a reason for the darkness lingering in this house. Then, she saw the desk drawer, slightly ajar. Her pulse quickened. She reached for it, her breath hitching as she pulled it open. Inside there were documents, quills, ink bottles long dried to crusted black, and beneath them, a single letter. Charlotte's breath caught as she unfolded the parchment. The ink faded, the edges yellowed with time. It was addressed to her, but she had never seen it before. She read the first line, and the air seemed to vanish from her lungs. My dearest Charlotte, I hear the whispers at night. Something is watching me in the dark. Charlotte's fingers tightened around the fragile paper. The words sent chills down her spine. Edward had written this before he died. Her mind reeled. He had known. He had felt it too. A surge of cold dread clawed through her. This was not her imagination. Edward had feared something in this house before he passed. Her breath quickened as she read further. I have searched for the source, but the house holds its secrets well. Shadows stretch where they should not. The air shifts when I am alone. I wake to the feeling of fingers pressing against my skin, only to find nothing but darkness staring back at me. Charlotte swallowed hard. She wanted to stop, but she couldn't. If something happens to me, Charlotte, know this: I am still here. I fear I will never leave. She nearly dropped the letter. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Edward had been afraid. He had known he was doomed before his death. But why had he never told her? A sudden horrible thought struck her. This was one letter. Were there more? Her eyes darted around the study, scanning for any possible hiding place. Then she saw it. The floorboards, slightly raised in one corner. Charlotte dropped to her knees. Her breath came in frantic bursts as she pried the wood apart. Dust rose in small clouds, the scent of age and decay curling into the air. And beneath them, dozens of letters. She lifted the stack of parchment, her hands shaking violently. Each one was addressed to her. None had ever been delivered. Her chest felt tight as she spread them across the desk, her eyes darting from page to page, her heart pounding louder with each passing word. It watches me from the corners just beyond the candlelight. It whispers my name when I am alone. Charlotte, I swear, something is in this house with me. Letter after letter, his words grew more frantic. His handwriting became jagged, almost desperate. I tried to leave, but every door led me back to the same room. It does not want me to go. I am beginning to think I was never alone to begin with. Charlotte's vision blurred with panic. Her dead husband had been trapped in this house, and now, so was she. She staggered back from the desk, nearly knocking over the chair. The air in the room changed. It was heavier now, like someone was watching her. Then, from somewhere behind her, a soft whisper right against her ear. You were never supposed to find those. Charlotte spun around. The study was empty, but the door had swung open, and beyond it, down the darkened hallway, a shadow moved. Charlotte did not enter her bedroom that night. She couldn't. The air inside it felt wrong, thick with something unseen, something that had pressed against her in the dark. She had spent the entire day searching through Edward's letters, her mind unraveling with every word she read. Her husband had known. He had been haunted, and now, so was she. Instead, she remained in the parlor, where the fire burned low and steady, filling the room with a warmth that did little to chase away the chill clinging to her bones. She tried to convince herself she was safe here, that whatever walked these halls at night would not follow her. But deep down, she knew better. Charlotte pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her chair angled toward the fire. Her fingers curled around the armrests in a white-knuckled grip. The room was quiet, except for the occasional pop and hiss of the flames. Her gaze flickered around the parlor, taking in the familiar surroundings. The grand windows draped in heavy velvet, the faded floral wallpaper, the polished wooden floors. And then, her eyes landed on the mirror, the massive gilded mirror above the fireplace. At first, it reflected only what it should: the parlor, the flickering firelight, herself. But something about the way it shimmered, the way the shadows bent within its surface, made her stomach turn. It felt deeper than it should be, like a doorway rather than a reflection. She forced herself to look away, exhaling shakily. She was letting her mind play tricks on her. She was exhausted. That was all. Then, a movement, just at the edge of her vision. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She turned her head slightly, her eyes drawn, against her will, back to the mirror. The reflection was wrong. The parlor was the same, the firelight flickering lazily across the walls. But she was not alone. Behind her chair, something moved. A shadow. A figure standing just behind her. Charlotte's body locked in place. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her shawl, her knuckles turning bone white. The figure loomed closer in the reflection, tall and gaunt, its form slightly distorted in the warped glass. A man. No. Edward. His face. It was smiling. A grotesque, unnatural grin. A grin that did not belong to the man she had loved. His lips stretched too wide, curling up at the corners in an expression of pure malice. His hollow eyes locked onto her, dark and endless, swallowing the dim light around them. Charlotte's pulse thundered in her ears. She could feel it. It was right behind her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the chair, her knuckles turning bone white. Turn around. The thought screamed through her skull. She had to look. She had to see. Her breath hitched as she slowly, so slowly, turned her head. Empty. The parlor behind her was empty. Her stomach twisted violently, but when she looked back at the mirror, Edward was still there, closer now, too close. His skeletal fingers curled over the back of her chair in the reflection, his body bending unnaturally as he leaned toward her. His grin widened, his lips parted, and then he spoke. A single word. A whisper so soft it barely stirred the air. Charlotte. Charlotte screamed. She lurched forward, grabbing the nearest object, a candlestick from the table, and hurled it at the mirror with every ounce of strength she had. The impact sent a deafening crack through the parlor. The glass splintered. Deep, jagged fractures spread across the surface, distorting the reflection. Edward's grinning face split into twisted, fractured pieces. But he was still smiling, even as the cracks ran through his image. Even as shards began to tremble loose, his black eyes remained locked onto hers, watching. Charlotte stumbled back, her breath ragged, hands shaking violently. The room was dead silent. Charlotte had not lit the fireplace that night. The parlor mirror, cracked and broken, still sat above the hearth, reflecting the dim glow of the lone candle she had dared to keep lit. The glass was fractured, jagged lines running through the reflection like veins of rot. She had covered it at first, a sheet draped over the surface, a feeble attempt to block out the twisted image that had haunted her the night before. But the sheet would not stay. She had woken twice already to find it on the floor. The third time, she left it where it fell, and now he was calling her name. Charlotte. The voice was not right. It had started soft, like a memory, a familiar sound from another time. But now, it was changing. Deeper hollow. Wrong. Hungry. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, her heart pounding, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The air around her grew dense, thick with an unseen presence, something pressing against the walls, against the floorboards, against her. Then, a breath, right beside her ear. The candle beside her flickered, the shadows along the walls twisted. Charlotte could feel it now, something in the room. The temperature plummeted, the warmth stolen from the air in an instant. Her breath misted before her lips, curling into the darkness like an offering to whatever was watching her from the unseen corners of the room. She clutched the blanket tighter, her fingers ice cold, trembling. Edward! The name barely escaped her lips. A long pause. Then, a soft, wet clicking, like teeth scraping together. Right, beside her. Charlotte bolted upright. Nothing. The room was empty. The whisper was gone, but the air remained heavy, pressing down on her like a suffocating weight. And then, bang! The door to her bedroom slammed shut. Charlotte gasped, throwing herself out of bed. The candlelight shuddered, its tiny flame flickering violently as if struggling to survive. The door had shut on its own. Or rather, something had shut it. She could feel it. The presence in the room, watching, waiting. Her throat was dry, her skin crawling with an unbearable sensation. A knowledge that something was just beyond sight. Slowly, she turned. The mirror. Even in the dim glow of the candle, she could see its fractured surface gleaming. And within its cracks, a shadow. Not hers, not anyone's. It stood just behind her, watching, grinning. Her breath caught, and then a handprint appeared on the glass. A pale, skeletal hand pressed against the inside of the mirror. From within, the fingers dragging downward, leaving streaks of frost and decay against the broken surface. The reflection shifted. Edward's face moved in the shards of glass, but his eyes were hollow. His mouth was open too wide, and he was still whispering. Charlotte. The whispers would not stop. Charlotte could not escape the whispers. They followed her, creeping through the walls, slipping beneath the doors, curling around her like unseen fingers in the dead of night. It was Edward's voice. But it was not Edward, and she knew. If she did nothing, if she allowed this thing to linger, it would never leave. Edward was trapped. Something had taken him. Something had used him. And now, it wanted her. The spiritualist's studio. Charlotte wasted no time. At first light, she pulled on her cloak and hurried through the fog-drenched streets, ignoring the way the townspeople turned to watch her as she passed. She needed answers. The photographer's studio stood silent, its door slightly ajar. Inside, dust, silence, shadows. Charlotte moved deeper into the darkened room, her breath shallow as she reached the wall of photographs. Her stomach twisted. She had expected horror, expected to find something proving that Thomas Ellsworth had been a fraud, a man who trapped souls within his cursed images. But there was nothing. No cursed artifacts, no hidden chambers filled with captured spirits, only empty abandoned shelves, and a single letter addressed to her. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she picked up the letter, breaking the old wax seal with unsteady hands. The ink was dark, and as she read, her world fell apart. Mrs. Ashbury, I write to you with a heavy heart. I fear you have sought me out under false assumptions. I have spent my life studying the supernatural, yet never have I captured something as restless as your late husband. I have reviewed the image countless times, searching for deception, seeking proof that my camera has lied. But it did not. The The spirit in that photograph is not trapped. It is hunting. And I must warn you, what Edward Ashbury became in death was not shaped by me. It was shaped by you. Charlotte's breath hitched. Her fingers clenched around the paper as she forced herself to keep reading. The whispers he heard in life, the sickness that plagued his final weeks. It was no curse, Mrs. Ashbury. It was you. Charlotte staggered backward, the room spinning around her. That was not true. It was lies, lies meant to frighten her, but the words burned as she read them. You poisoned him. Slowly, carefully. The herbs you placed in his tea, the powders you left upon his pillow, they seeped into his mind, twisting his reality, making him doubt his own sanity. You made him hear the whispers. You made him see the shadows. You sent him spiraling into the darkness long before the river took him. Charlotte's hands trembled violently. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were pressing inward. Memories surfaced, ugly, hidden things. The nights she had whispered to him while he slept. The candles burned in secret. The spells she had murmured beneath her breath. The way he had looked at her in those final days, pleading, terrified. He had known. And now, he had come back. Charlotte ran. She did not remember leaving the studio, did not remember the streets, did not remember the looks the townspeople gave her. By the time she reached her doorstep, the house was waiting. The door was already open. She stepped inside, and the candles blew out. The air grew heavy. The whispers returned. But now, they were laughing, a breath on her neck, a touch on her wrist, and then, from the shadows, a hand, cold, rotting, gripping her own. Charlotte turned, and Edward was there. No longer her husband, no longer the man she had murdered. His flesh hung in wet, decayed strips. His lips were peeled back into an unnatural grin, the blackened gums rotting around jagged, waterlogged teeth. His eyes, black, empty, hungry. Charlotte let out a strangled sob, stumbling backward. But Edward's grip was iron. Did you think I would forget? His voice slithered through the air, a voice that was no longer human. Charlotte screamed. She tried to pull away, but his fingers tightened, crushing bone, dragging her toward him. The house shook, the very walls vibrating as the shadows crawled toward her. The whispering grew louder. The floor beneath her feet split open, a chasm of blackness, a void, waiting for her. Charlotte kicked, fought, sobbed, but Edward was stronger. And then, he pulled her in. The last thing she saw was his rotting grin. Then, the house fell silent. Charlotte Ashbury was never seen again. And as the last ember of Charlotte's existence vanished into the void, the house stood still, silent, empty, satisfied, until a soft creak echoed through the corridors. The air shifted, and somewhere from deep within the darkness of the abandoned halls, a whisper. Charlotte. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Click the bell icon so you never miss any new content. Stay tuned for more creepy stories coming soon. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the dark, subscribe for more. Because the best horror isn't what you hear, it's what follows when the story is over.